Thanks for tuning in. Coming up on LiveWire, coming up real soon, we're going to be talking with Steve Beck, who is the director of the Sacramento Historical Society and past director of the Sutter Fort. It's a very interesting time we live in, and how it's documented is interesting because it'll become history. We'll be talking about this time or that event. In 10 years, it'll be part of a historical picture. So please stay tuned, and we'll be talking with Steve Beck in just a minute. Hello, I'm Ray Tedder, and where are you, Steve Beck? Are you on with me? I hope you are, because it's important. There you are. Hi, how are you? Good, good. You know, let's see. I grew up very interested in history myself and how history is created and documented. And I sit on a board of a kind of a foundation called the Living History Center, which is a granting agency to those people who express history as a historical character. Somebody who plays Sutter, let's say, would be somebody that we would fund to do a special showings where he might not have been seen before, to talk about who Sutter was. And all these characters, Abraham Lincoln, the Renaissance pleasure fair people have their queen, and it's all about documenting history with living history. But we also make statues, create documentary films. I'm very interested in how we document history, and you suggest that we're going through a change, maybe because of this document. What do you think, sir?
Well, you know, it's certainly a possibility, Ray. You know, you made a great point in the introduction there about people are going to judge us in the future. We will become history. In 170 years, how are people going to view what we're doing now? And boy, I didn't know there was such an organization as what you represent. I can't believe I was at Sutter's Fort for 21 years and never tried to hit you guys up for any money. It's amazing. You know, we've had a living history program at Sutter's Fort since the 1960s. They even did some things in the 1930s and 40s. But yeah, it's certainly communications and the ability for people to transmit information rapidly, whether that information is accurate or not, is going to affect the way people perceive history, the way people talk about history, and the actions they take upon that history, I think, or at least their views of it.
So, and history being the, whatever that history is, being the values, whether they're negative or positive. I produced a play about Dorothea Puente a few months ago, and it's about a historical event, a certain kind of murderer in our midst, but that was history for our town. It was a negative thing, but there are positive things, people who had positive influences.
Well, you know, yeah, history isn't always pretty. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. I think that the biggest problem that we've gotten into now is that also you showed the cell phone, and that talks about communications, but it's more like the Twitter life that we lead, that everything we say and everything we're starting to learn happens in 140 characters. And that isn't how history is. Mm-hmm. And whenever, in my training's actually in anthropology. I mean, I loved history, and I've become a historian over time through doing, you know, cultural anthropology essentially. But I see that people aren't getting the full story about the actions that people are taking, whether it's vandalism or whether it's just asking that something be removed, don't seem to have the whole facts, or not even trying to get the entire facts about the actions that they're taking. Whenever you try to compare 19th century history with 21st century values and mores, they're never going to be equal. The only way that we can judge people on a relatively equal basis between the past and the present is to see how those people were viewed in the past and how they were viewed within their own peers and their own community. And, Sutter's the one I'm most familiar with, but it's beyond John Sutter. There's lots of things that have happened. Why is a Sutter hospital, Sutter County, 2 Sutter cities, a Sutter savings and loan, a Sutter junior high? Why did all these people elect to name something after John Sutter? It wasn't because he was a terrible man enslaving people. It's something has gotten lost between the time that Sutter lived and the way we're viewing and valuing things today.
That's very interesting. However, there are some modern things. There used to be an elementary school called Gady Elementary School.
Yes.
It's not
Park,
called that anymore.
Gady Park, or Goethe, and certainly Goethe's, views on genetics and his following of Nietzsche is something that, that's unfounded. And that is something that we can look at through the eyes of modernity, because we now understand genetics a lot better and how things like that work, and that you really, too many things are based upon just happenstance or it's the word I'm looking for, but that people could change through genetics and cannot be guided by genetics. I mean, they try to do it in the horse racing industry, but you can't do it with people.
True. That's absolutely true.
But yeah, it's a very complex problem. There is an organization to which I belong now, and it's just gotten started. You can go to the Facebook page, which is it's Navigating History, and it's a very diverse group of people who have several different ideas. It's not like everyone is in favor of retaining every statue that's out there, because there certainly are ones that shouldn't be retained. They should, or if they are retained, they should be retained in an environment where only those people interested in that subject can go look at that subject. It shouldn't be something that the public has to see. And so there are different people. There are some statues that I wouldn't, that I don't think should be part of the public domain, where the public can be insulted. There is a large portion of the public that could be insulted by its presence. In turn, though, there's also the idea that if you do have something that is controversial, or where there are 2 sides to the argument, that perhaps what we could do is show the other side, the alternative history to what is on that statue or that plaque, and the people who support the alternative history and why they support it. And that way everyone has a voice. And I think that's really where the problem is that everyone wants a voice. And there are people out there thinking that their voice is not being heard because it wasn't heard in that 19th century. And how do you solve that problem? And the only way to solve that problem is through inclusion of some sort. I don't think that vandalism is the answer to that problem. And I think really what everyone should do, rather than taking these knee-jerk reactions, is to evaluate each statue or each public identity as it comes across and decide what's the best thing to do with this. The Sutter Club, one of the biggest business organizations or most important business organizations in Sacramento, did not come into existence until 1887. John Sutter had been dead for 8 years before they became, or 7 years before they even came into existence. And yet they chose to name their business organization after Sutter. Why? It was because that even in the late 19th century, the value that Sutter had exhibited during his time as a leader in Sacramento was still important and still valued. That's why so many things end up being named Sutter. So what is the extent of Sutter's actions against the native people? Where does that information come from, and what was the extent of it? And I think that those are questions that need to be answered. I mean, there's some things that happen. Just quickly, I don't know if you know about, in San Francisco, they tore down the statue of Ulysses S. Grant. So not only did he fight to eradicate slavery, but Ulysses S. Grant, at a time in his life when he was almost destitute, he was given a choice of resigning or being court-martialed for his drinking when he was at Fort Point and at Fort Humboldt here in California. He elected to resign from the Army. He goes back home to his wife. His father-in-law, recognizing that he wants his daughter to live a better life, gives them a slave. The only thing that Ulysses S. Grant had of value at one time was that $1,000 slave. And what did he do with that slave? He freed him. He freed him for nothing. So what was the motivation to tear down the statue of Ulysses S. Grant? I think that what we're running into, whether it's Grant or Sutter or Sarah, is just a great big blob of ignorance. Now, don't confuse that with stupidity. It's just not knowing the whole story.
I think you're right. You know, in Washington, D.C., during the riots there, or the marches or the protests, whatever you want to call them, there's a statue of the Polish patriot of the Revolutionary War, who was a stumper for freeing the slaves during that time, during, you know, the 1770s and 1780s. And his statue was defaced as well. So, but that has to do with riots, I think, and the energy of the riot. And you're right about ignorance, and that takes precedence sometimes during
it's just so difficult to evaluate 19th century events by 21st century happenings. I mean, what's next? Do we take down the Washington Monument because George Washington owned 170 slaves? Do we take down the Jefferson Memorial? You know, colonization by nature is derogatory to the people who were there when the colonists arrived. And yet the human condition is based on colonization, whether it's, Homo erectus walking out of Africa and displacing Australopithecines or other pre-Homo sapiens that are out there, or whether it is Homo sapiens sapien leaving Africa and displacing Homo sapien neanderthalensis and all these others. It's colonization, and someone is going to suffer through colonization. That someone is always going to be the people who are there when the colonization happens. And, you know, I understand that that is the real problem with the Sarah statue, and what the native population, the California Indian population, finds wrong with Sarah is that he, and just like Sutter, they were instigators. John Sutter opened the Sacramento Valley to Western civilization. Now, John Sutter personally may not have abused the Indians to the extent that he is often accused, but he was the one who opened the door, who allowed Western civilization to come in, that led directly to the gold discovery, that led directly to the genocide of the California Indian population. You know, John Sutter, for most intents and purposes at that time, was revered by the Indians. He was their protector, but that is by 19th century standards. Now, don't think for 1 minute that I would have liked to have been an Indian working for John Sutter. I'm sure it wasn't the best job, but it was a job. And there is a tremendous amount of evidence written evidence as well as even oral tradition that says that John Sutter paid his Indian laborers, that they weren't slaves. You know, let me give you a real quick quote. This is from a man, Peter Burnett. He was the first governor of California. This list that you see on the screen right now, let me get to this just real first. These are the soldiers that occupied Sutter's Fort during the Mexican-American War. It's hard to read because it is a very old document. This is a representation or a reprint of something called the Kern Papers. And during this period, Sutter's Fort was renamed Fort Sacramento. But you'll notice that all of those names with the pays next to them, except for the top guy who was John Sutter, the rest of them were Indians. How did John Sutter, when John Sutter got here in August of 1839, he had himself 3 mountain men, one from Italy, one from Belgium, one from Ireland, and 10 Hawaiians, 2 of whom were women. That's it. The entire landing party for John Sutter when he got here in 1839 was 13 people, 14 counting Sutter himself. How did 14 people subjugate thousands of California Indians, as has been presented by the people who took down Sutter's statue? This, you can see, is the most accurate depiction ever made of Sutter's Fort. There are no photographs of the fort or ambrotypes or daguerreotypes. This is an artistic rendition done by Joseph Warren Revere. Just happens to be the grandson of Paul Revere, but unrelated to our story. During the Mexican-American War, though, he was here as a lieutenant in the United States Navy, and he drew that picture. And what you see in that picture are soldiers drilling. Those soldiers are Indians. One of the first things John Sutter did to establish himself in the valley was to make friends with a local group of Indians, several local groups of Indians, about 35 different rancherias between about where Fruit Ridge Road is today and Marysville. And he then allied himself with them and made an army out of those that wanted to become soldiers. He gave them guns. He broke one of the primary tenets of Mexican law he'd sworn to uphold. Don't arm the Indians. Sutter not only armed them, he made an army of them. He gave them guns and taught them how to use those guns so that they could protect his fort. Who were they to protect the fort from? You know, that is always a big question. You know, the slavery issue. California Indians were enslaving each other long before any Europeans ever got here.
Yes.
There's 3 different eras that anthropologists labeled them into horizons 1, 2, and 3, where people came into the California area and annihilated or assimilated the people that were here already. The archaeological evidence supports this through the different types of burials that they used and the different types of burial goods. I mean, heck, the Mojave Road, the back door to California, was largely created as a way to send captured Indians, captured by Indians, into the Arizona region where the Hopi, the Navajo, and other southwestern Indian groups enslaved them. So, you know, even the definition of a slave becomes very complex. It's
wow.
I wish I had the answers to these questions, Ray.
So how, I mean, right now we were getting on to talking about the changes, recent changes in history, and how we record history and the growth of interest in history, because I believe that we've gone through a dark period of teaching history in schools, and not participating in the love of the development of our culture, our current culture.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, who writes the history, Ray? The victors write the history. The people that are in control write the history. They write it to their slant. You know, there's some Englishmen out there from the 1770s who probably think that the colonists were out of line when they declared independence, and they had abused laws that had been established to give them more freedom. It's just so complex that how do you then take history as a regular study course and study all aspects of that history? That's a difficult one to do. Have we been remiss that we haven't done that? I mean, are the books that we're using now not presenting both sides of the history? At least to my position, I try to read everything I can. If you've read one book about John Sutter, all you've read is enough to be stupid, because one book is only going to give you one man's opinion and whoever he quotes. You have to read what everyone said about him, or you have to listen to the oral histories that everyone said about him. And after you've gotten a broad spectrum of what has been said, then you might have an understanding of what happened. I mean, the one thing that the California Indian population has trouble explaining is, how did 14 people, how did the Indians allow themselves to be subjugated and enslaved by a group of 14 people? When the exploring expedition of the United States Navy under a man named Charles Wilkes, when they came and explored the interior in 1841, they found 30 white men. Sutter had been here for 2 years, and all he had accumulated around him, other than hundreds of Indians, was 30 white men. If Sutter was so abusive of these Indians, why didn't they turn on him? Why didn't they turn on him and his small entourage of people that he had? They had the guns. Sutter gave them to him. And Sutter rarely left the fort unless he was accompanied by an Indian guard. They were known as the Lanceros. It was a privilege to have that uniform and to be part of it. And 15 men rode out with Sutter for his protection from other California Indians. This is what Sutter's fort looked like. This is one of the renditions. We saw the other one that's probably a little more accurate, that was from Joseph Warren Revere. But Sutter, and this is the Sutter statue that was recently taken down. I don't have any great affinity for that statue. It was purchased by the local Swiss community to identify John Sutter as being the Swiss man who colonized the Sacramento Valley. It's only been in place for about 37 years. But does that mean that you should go and vandalize it? And vandalize it without an explanation? What was their explanation? Frankly, I'm kind of glad that Sutter Hospital took it down. It is a valuable statue, and this way it will be preserved. And here we can see the process that they went to of removing it. So now it can be put. And like other statues of Sarah and other people that are controversial and under conflict right now, it can be stored in a place for safekeeping until we're smart enough, or until we have enough information to evaluate these people and what they did and decide whether we should have it at all. This is one where there's a lot of controversy over. This is in the California state capitol, the Rotunda. And of course, this is Queen Isabella and Columbus. And frankly, what does Columbus have to do with California? But this is an incredibly valuable piece of marble done by a famous Italian sculptor and granted to this California, to the state capitol by D.O. Mills, one of the original bankers in Sacramento, frankly, because he didn't have room for it in his bank. But he put it in the Capitol in 1868, and I believe about that. I'm not sure on that date. The address you see on the screen right now is the Sacramento Historical Society. I'm one of the directors of that historical society. And if people do want to learn more, I encourage them to go to the website, to listen to some of the webinars or some of the Zoom sessions that we've been doing lately. And this is the Facebook page for that, where you can make a comment about what I've said today, or about things that people have written, or comments that they have made already. You know, I'd like to hear what people have to say. Ray, when they first approached me about being on your show today, the first thing I did was reach out to some of my history friends and say, you know, where do you guys come from? What do you think we should do that can improve this situation? And the one universal comment is that we need to talk it over before actions are taken. But like you said earlier, you know, sometimes it's the emotions. You get hung up in the emotions of the riot or whatever it is, and those emotions lead to bad things happening by people who frankly don't know the history about how they're acting and what they're doing. Poor Winipero Serra, you know, he was the colonist. He started the mission system. I think he opened 9 of the missions himself. But if you read anything that was written at that time, one thing Serra did was try to protect and defend the California Indians, because he was, while he's trying to bring a strange God to them, he is their protector, because it wasn't the priest, it wasn't the church, it was the misguided, miscreant soldiers that had been sent here from Spain or Mexico, who were abusing the Indian population. Remember, this is the age of Napoleon during a lot of this. And you know, the good soldiers are all fighting in Europe. They're not here guarding the missions.
That's just good. We have 2 minutes. I have to give you fair warning.
Good. You know, I can get carried away sometimes.
Oh no, it's great. Important statement. You know, I mean, I looked at the Historical Society website, and I find it really interesting. They're great books that are written locally, and I'm very interested how statues up here and where they come from. They're gifts of rich people, organizations put them together sometimes. Cities put their founders on a plaque or a statue or whatever. And it's an interesting thing, because it then becomes part of the history of the local area, and maybe even the fort itself becomes a part of what other people come to learn about when they come to Sacramento.
About 70,000 fourth graders a year pass free through Sutter's Fort to learn a bit of history. And we do, and of course, we're on the same grounds as the California State Indian Museum. I always argued that you should get both places for one admission price, so that people can get both sides of the story right there at that time.
You did it. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for talking to me about this. And let's talk about a number of other issues of dealing with how history is changing and how we record history. There is a historical society in, I think it's Kansas now, is recording COVID with photographs and film, and plans to make it an exhibit in the future to teach about what this is all about. So I want to thank you for talking to me, and thank you for being who you're doing, what you're doing. Really appreciate that. And we have to say goodbye.
Okay. Thank you, Ray. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.